they're under attack every hour, every day by Chinese adversaries, Russian adversaries, Iranians, North Koreans. They all want a different thing. Some of it's just to put, cryptocurrency miners on their system. You run up their cloud bill, make some money back home. I mean, it's all kinds of different things that they have to focus on. And they're having to defend themselves as if they were the Pentagon at every moment, which is hard.
My guest today is cybersecurity leader Matt Hayden. Matt has over 20 years of experience in cybersecurity, and he previously served as the Assistant Secretary for Cyber Infrastructure Risk and Resilience Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. There, he directed national efforts to secure our critical infrastructure, protect federal networks, and counter cybercrime.
There's a political layer to everything in this town, but when you get to the operational layer, that's where rubber meets the road, and people are really trying hard to make sure the right thing gets done for the American people 24/7.
These days, he's working with General Dynamics IT as the VP of Cyber and Emerging Threats, and he serves as a senior fellow at Auburn University's McCrary Institute.
I share the same confidence that the agency does, that we have a system in place that allows for an individual to cast their ballot, that ballot to be counted, and that count to be something they can audit, and that there's not a cyber means to disrupt that process.
Our conversation covers some pressing topics, including the security of our election processes, and these are important things to hear. And now, here's Matt Hayden. Thank you for coming on. I want to jump right in, and I want to set you a question that I've gotten to the habit of asking folks, which is, how would you introduce yourself? If we meet in a professional setting, like, who is Matt, and where do you start to even describe something? When I look at your resume, covers a lot of ground. Where do you start?
So I usually just the same way my kids would answer that question is, Dad's a cyber guy, and
that's a good answer. My kids say I just fix computers. I'm like, hold on, buddy.
I've evolved from the guy who fixes the printer to cyber guy. So it's a proud moment as a dad that they actually acknowledge that. But it's also cultural, like the word cyber's in everything now, and AI and everything being leveraged to where they're like, oh, my dad does that. Whatever that is, that's what he does.
I guess this generation, how old are your kids?
So teenagers.
Okay, so their generation is going to be way more aware of this than we were. Mm-hmm. I was pretty aware of the internet. But like security as a concept, or that, China and the United States were fighting and all that, no idea. Do your kids as teenagers, are they aware?
They are. They could probably answer some of these podcast questions pretty well also. So okay. I've got them pretty well equipped, just because in living in Northern Virginia, you have an audience that talks about strange things at a young age. And so they have the ability to be conversational.
So as someone who grew up in this area, and my dad was in IT in the vicinity. And so I've always lived here. I did a brief stretch away. And every time I travel, I tell this to people who grew up elsewhere, like, DC, you do sometimes feel like the center of the world. And everyone here is so important and in such a rush and works for somebody else who's super important, and they all, somehow work at the Pentagon and all that. So you can start to feel, like you're getting a different experience. But anyway, you talked about your kids. Cyber guy. That's Matt.
And that's the easiest answer. I also have a wife that's in the public policy sphere, and her challenge is trying to explain what I do. So she says the same thing.
Cyber guy.
I wish they'd say national security guy, because candidly, that's really where my strengths and focus are. But that's a harder conversation, because then they turn to say, "Oh, do you work at the Pentagon?"
Yeah.
I'm like, no.
There's one view.
I'm not running around with the chain briefcase, but working with everybody who needs to beef up that cyber protections for national security is a full-time gig.
It's a good backdrop for the concept of the podcast. The watchers. The concept was, who's watching out for us? And I'm a cyber practitioner. Like, my background is, started fixing computers, or I really started building computers so I could play video games, turned into a whole career, but very practical at that level. And so my initial concept for this was like, let's talk to other cyber people. Mm-hmm. It's quickly expanded into understanding, there's a whole apparatus of people across many industries. The other background that I have, which hopefully it's not getting annoying that I constantly plug it, but I'm a paramedic outside of my cybersecurity world, and they connect so often in my head. And it's another industry where it's like people who are watching out for us, who we trust are going to be there to do a competent job when we need them. But anyway, I love that the way you say that. Like, I wish people saw me. I'm a national security guy. I'm not just a cyber guy. My efforts in the cyber domain are happening because I serve national security.
Yes. And the beauty of a lot of that is that people appreciate that somebody's doing it. They don't opaquely know how all of that works other than just
and
to
they
say,
trust that somebody's
they
doing
trust
it.
somebody's on it. Top men. Indiana Jones at the end. Top men are on this.
Yeah, there's something of an ignorance is bliss.
Yes.
Like, someone's probably watching that.
And it does take a lot of committed folks to both definitions of committed sometimes to really run into the fire and say, look, this is a problem we see not getting addressed. The policy side is where I've spent the last 8 years, and that's been, are the authorities in the right place? Is the workforce in the right place? Is the technology being brought to bear in the right way? Are we leveraging security in the right way? And that's a conversation that, luckily for me, is on both sides, government and industry. And so it's a fun job, but it does have an end game that's very dicey if you don't get it right.
Yeah, and let's hone in on the what I'll call institution side. Right now, because you have a background at some of the big institutions on this big mission to watch out for us. And I think without delving too deep into politics, institutions are kind of on the back foot right now. There is some distrust. I always tell folks that, I've had access to a lot of institutions and people who are in them. And I consistently find everyone's just trying to do the best thing for you, the citizen, for the country. Like, it's not all malicious intent. Sure, do some people have side motives? Yeah, but almost everyone I've met is like, dude, I just joined because I wanted to make a difference. I want to serve the public. Has that been your experience?
It is. There's a political layer to everything in this town. But when you get to the operational layer, that's where rubber meets the road, and people are really trying hard to make sure the right thing gets done for the American people 24/7. And so that's been my experience. I came in as a political appointee and really enjoyed working with the workforce that had been there, in some cases, decades before me, that really were helpful in making sure I knew where we had gone and where there were some shortcomings that they needed political help to get across some hurdles. And it really was a strong organization that had mission first all over it. So that's not just speaking of DHS experience and the newly created CISA while I was there. It's also when we worked in the interagency. You heard the same from Treasury, from Energy, from all the other different partners, including DOD and the Pentagon, that always have that mission first. They have a mantra you don't have to question. But knowing going in that everybody really had this one team, one fight, once you got past that political layer, was great.
And that is, at least as you find, still the case, right? I mean, as much as it's all been politicized, again, I talk to people who are in institutions, they don't like the politicizing that has happened, but they're thriving in spite of it. And they're like, listen, man, again, we're just on mission. We're trying to keep that segmented out. There's a lot of theatrics happening about institutions, and there's undermining happening, but the people in them seem just motivated to, like, I'm just going to keep on keeping on.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with that 100%. I think you see it, especially in the way the agencies are starting to work together, so much better. There used to be nascent conversations about competition. Like, oh no, is DHS and DOJ competing on this particular cyber issue? They are working so much better together than when I was even there. And they were great when I was there, but they're truly embedded and integrated, working as one team, one fight in a more mature way now, especially with things like ransomware. The ransomware task force, amazing. The collegiality across the board, the way those teams work together, we didn't have that when 4 or 5 years ago. It's really an impressive thing to see.
Is that making the progress we want? So like, say an effort like, hey, we need to do better about being resilient to ransomware. You think getting better collaboration between agencies should mean the end impact is, hey, we're more resilient. Is that panning out?
It is, but it's also the full spectrum of it. So you have DOD that has their mission and their cyber command efforts that work on the international side. But on the domestic side, if there is an action the DOJ and the FBI can take to turn off all these C2 bugs across the country, they're about to affect a lot of critical infrastructure in partnership with CISA for all the things. That's something that's really important and taking hold. Also, when people get ransomware now, there are libraries of decryptors now the federal government has to offer. So instead of going down that route of paying that money, you can actually go through and get a decryptor from one of these groups. And so the FBI actually has a carrot, not just a stick now, in partnership with CISA, where they're actually watching the internet and looking for these C2 signals and reaching out to people and saying, hey, look, somebody's trying to drop ransomware in your network. We want to make sure you're prepared for it, and working from there left of incident. So it's really a whole team, one fight that's impressive to see move because they weren't that coordinated back then. And so it's a positive effort. And I think they're up to 1,200 agencies they've done pre-notification on. Now, I won't give CISA complete credit for finding all 1,200. They do have another part of this program where other security researchers see it and tell and share anonymously with CISA, and CISA reaches out on behalf of them and communicates with those CISOs. But 1,200 organizations have received pre-notification of potential ransomware and not had the incident happen because of that. And so that's
a pretty meaningful impact.
Big merit badge I had never seen before.
Yeah, no, and that's interesting that I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, it's a pilot program. It's not. It's
keeping it under wraps.
Yeah. We'll wait till it really makes the news. Yeah, but 1,200 is a big number they hit just recently.
Well, yeah, especially considering the impact ransomware can have on organizations. I mean, I know businesses that have shut doors permanently because of a ransomware incident, or have paid out. Let's see, the last one I worked, which was years ago, thankfully, was $500,000 in Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. It's like, man, that's a massive impact on a relatively small business. Yeah. So, well, it's good to hear. And I do think that pans out in what I've seen. Like I do feel like the federal government and CISA and these agencies are getting more savvy, especially as I've gotten to know people who have been in those institutions, and I'm hearing more of like stories like this. From an outside perspective, sometimes it kind of feels like, just another big government bureaucracy. But you hear stories about what they're actually doing and meeting people and how energetic they are to do good work. Like as a taxpayer, as a citizen, say, okay, yeah, I can rest a little bit more. Like there are people who are looking at that, which is good.
Yeah, and just as you mentioned from a political layer, we didn't see a drop. We saw an increase in cyber performance from the government on defensive measures, shared services, convening all these different parties. It wasn't something that took a speed bump with a change in administrations. This team at an operational level just ran straight ahead. The transition from Krebs to Easterly was great at CISA. They had continuing leadership over at the FBI. It's been really impressive to watch.
So that you've had a lot of interesting experience on the institution side. We'll get to the private sector side, but let's bring it back. How does Matt Hayden go from child, I guess, to sitting across the table from me with this resume, with all the different things that you've done? Like, was this all calculated? Is this, sort of a winding, meandering path? Give me the story.
So it's the equivalent of a ping pong ball in the wind. I mean, basically you start with, you're going to go to college because, that's what everyone did. And
if you want to have a good job and all that.
Yep. You're going to go. And so I
Great
went.
Advice because I didn't go.
And I started out, as everyone does, as pre-med. I made it far enough to where I learned that the bone saw makes me faint. Okay. And in such a manner that they let me know I wasn't fit for the medical profession. So unlike being a paramedic, I'm not that guy.
Listen, the bone saw, I've seen a couple. So when you're in paramedic training, you do have to go to rotations. And I've been in a couple operating rooms during surgeries. And I'll never forget, I did a rotation during an orthopedic surgery for a hip replacement. And I always tell people, you'd be shocked how close to carpenters orthopedics is.
Yes.
I mean, what I saw in there in terms of like the tools, I was like, I've seen that when I was visiting a house under construction. You guys have the same tool here.
Yes.
Yeah. And that made me queasy. I was like, all right, well, I'll just stick to the paramedic thing. Maybe not that part of it.
So after 3 years, I was ROTC. Okay. And so the Army was very happy for me to be a doctor until I wasn't able to. I then jumped over to management information systems to get a minor in computer science because it was the early 90s, .com, all of that. Everybody was trying to run towards that as fast as they could. Comically, the Army said, we don't have a role for that. And so they said, look, we're going to cut you loose. And I ended up having to pay for my own tuition and ended up taking on like 6 of those odd jobs of IT work and working for different providers across town. And one of the opportunities the University of Alabama has is where you can work for a part of the university to pay for part of your tuition. So I went to go work for the law school. And while I was working there, they had a very great dean. And he said, look, we're going to make our university stronger than it is in the rankings community. And a lot of that is technology. So I want you to look up how we can get all these smart boards, call Cisco. We're going to rewire everything, Wi-Fi, fiber, everything. We're going to make this the technological behemoth of a law school. And we're going to do it in 3 to 6 months. Oh, by the way, I can't hire new people. You can't contract new people. You have almost unlimited resources, but that's just because we're using our endowment to do this. Go forth and conquer.
The classic IT problem.
It is. And
do more with less and by tomorrow with no interruption.
Correct.
Thanks.
But it also meant that as a young kid, I got to run around with like fiber and manholes and grab senior people at Cisco and get routers programmed and have all the experience that you really can't get in a traditional sense and get hands-on with a lot of things really, really fast. Had a great team that did other things. Like I didn't touch the website. I didn't touch like traditional student stuff, but classrooms and infrastructure, all me, and it was a lot of fun. Yeah. Met my then girlfriend, who I had to get permission to date because she was a law student and I was a law employee.
Oh, so you had to get permission from the school.
I did, because I was in charge of all the electronic exam systems. So, there's a little conflict of interest there. You have to be very sensitive to. But she did great, didn't get perfect on all her tests. I say that she just did that for my benefit. And
she had to miss one or two.
Just to keep that suspicion down.
Yeah, that's fair.
And,
Good optics.
and she moved up to DC for a 1-year clerkship. And halfway through, they offered her a full-time job. And we were engaged and married in Alabama a year later, and I moved up. So it was a lot of fun. But I did not choose DC. I chose the smarter of the couple and chased her all the way up.
That's fair.
That got me through, I'd say, the I'm confident enough that I can handle any problem phase of my career development. Because you get thrown into this briar patch of, well, it's all on you, fix it. And you just, unlimited time and resources aren't always a thing. And so I got to really get hands-on on the way technology integrates and how to secure it, how to make it work for the user. So you had that use case and everything.
I think that's a great education pathway in IT, which is hands-on, no other option but to get it right. I had a very similar trajectory. Like I have been in managed IT services, outsourced IT services for most of my career. I took a brief hiatus and went into defense industry for a couple of years. But prior to that, it was like I got dispatched, never really know what I'm coming into. And it was, we got to fix the problem. So I developed a reputation in my managed services organization of just being the guy that you could throw out the problem. He'll figure it out.
Yep.
I didn't always know. There were times I was like in the ceiling pulling new, Cat 6 cable and learning how to cut, cable and set all that up or pull new fiber and all that, which is like phenomenal knowledge to have. But the more important thing is I have the knowledge that I can figure that out.
Right.
And
you
that's
built
made
up
me
a confidence
phenomenal,
level.
Yeah. Well, hold on. I'm going to pat myself on the back here. It's made me a really strong practitioner. It's made me a really, I think, a pretty strong security practitioner because I've had access and visibility and hands-on to so many systems and having to understand how they work. It's made me a pretty strong security practitioner. And it's something I talk about a lot when we get into conversations with people about workforce development and cyber education and the cyber job shortage and, the problem a lot of folks have where there's not enough entry-level access. And when I'd always try to push back on that a little bit and say, well, sometimes we get these cyber degree holders who haven't had any of that experience and they really struggle, I think, to connect the dots because they don't know how systems really operate. And to your point, like how you get application to the user, having the full workflow of understanding just makes it like, a switch has been flipped. And you're like, okay, cool. I got this.
Yeah. It's a systems of systems understanding that you can't get in a classroom traditionally unless you really go out and have some hands-on stuff. And so I appreciate that experience. It's what really set me where I'm going. And when I came to DC, I would have loved to have said my next step was national security, but my experience with the law school and law clinics took me to working for a trade association. And that trade association managed law clinics across the United States in every state and territory. And they had traditional IT problems, but they also had accessible technology problems. And they had data reporting, data mining, user systems, private cloud, a lot of advanced things that they weren't expecting to have to deal with. And so I came in the door because I came from one of their sister law clinics when I moved up here. I will say that the benefit for that office was it was inside the dotted line of being able to walk to have lunch with my wife, which was my criteria for moving up here and getting a job, was to stay
How
close.
many of the things you're going to tell me today are going to be impressive, but are also going to be because of your wife?
Probably most of them. I have
good.
one
Any
more
good
wife
stories
story
here?
that's hilarious. So, but that's for phase 3. So I go to this office and they said, look, we've got to start managing the data of all 50 states on their reporting to 8 different agencies in which they're serving the same client and asking the client the same questions, but it's been translated 8 different ways and reported through 8 different systems. And right now it's being done on paper. And so we got to build a cloud. We got to do all the things that was necessary to automate that and develop it and make it accessible, and then go out and train it in every one of the
same
states.
concept of having to pull new cable, just pull new
Data
concepts
science
and
became
stuff.
a new discipline. And so we worked that. And then we started working with them on consulting for e-records and e-discovery, because small legal shops that are working on behalf of Uncle Sam needed to behave as big legal shops that are doing business outside in the world. So we were teaching them modern legal and doing a lot of traveling just to make sure everybody had tools of the trade, as well as improving our efforts as a trade association to add value across the board for all these federal contracts. And then the federal government came to us and said, you're doing such a good job, we want you to manage the other side of the system through your trade association. So we were actually running the servers that we were sending the data to and the other side. So we were guilty of our own success. And that's what brought me into FISMA, cloud practice, all the different data systems, and brought me up to speed on all that.
So what's your first crossing of the threshold from private industry? Where's your first dabble into public sector?
So I was officially a consultant for the public sector for the 15 years when I got here. Like, my first job was like, you're employed by the Social Security Administration officially. And so I was dabbling in there, but to go into government as a public servant was 2016, technically 2017 in January, when I started first day. And working on the transition team and coming into DHS was eye-opening. I will say that you don't have the same perspective after you leave the SCIF as you do going in for the first time. I will tell you that you knew there were people that were always going after your system to try and do harm, but you didn't know how bad it was, especially in 2017, when we didn't have as many security systems in place and as much monitoring or awareness or transparency that we have today. And it was very hard not to come out of that room as like the sky is falling, Chicken Little. I mean, you came in and you get these briefings, and there are other professionals that have had this briefing every other Wednesday and aren't numb to it, but they know what the ramifications are and they know where the real risk is. And so it took about a year to understand the way government not just accepts risk, but how they look at it and how they operationalize mitigations to risk. And that's where I've really enjoyed that practice and worked from there across DHS, CISA, and now at General Dynamics.
Can you give me an example of something you're exposed to? Maybe not specific, because I'm sure it's classified or whatever, but like coming into that sort of environment, what sort of information were you blindsided by where you're like, oh my God, like I wouldn't have thought that.
So the luxury I have today is that a lot of what I worked on then is now unclassified and in the public domain. So we were seeing adversaries targeting critical infrastructure for reasons we didn't understand, and they were actively positioning to try and just gather intelligence.
Was that rather novel at the time?
To me, it was. To those in the room, I can't speak to 2-3 years before that, but for me, that was new to hear, because that wasn't something that was in the public domain. From an intelligence perspective, they've been monitoring. It's people have been knocking on doors and checking gates, and from a physical security aspect, as long as we've had critical infrastructure, You've had people trying to test the locks. From a digital infrastructure standpoint, things were coming more online. They were leveraging a lot of digital systems that just weren't connected to the internet in the past. And when they started to come online with all these systems, adversaries started to take notice as high-value targets. It used to be very expensive also to hack. Nation states had to put serious coin in the game to get into some of these systems, even what we would consider today to be low-hanging fruit. Now you've got ransomware as a service, so it's a completely
very
different world, and it's a much cheaper world. Doing bad doesn't cost as much. Now the 0 days are still very expensive, but once they're in the wild, that's a different animal. Back then you had to do nuanced hacks for every system, and it took time and it took opportunity and it was complicated. So there wasn't as much, but just the fact that they were going after domestic systems, as opposed to, you had this assumption like everybody's trying to pop the Pentagon's firewall. That was not the case. They were going after U.S. Defense industry. Every sector that is considered critical had somebody knocking on their doors. And specifically the financial services, they really had it bad in the 2016-17 era, in which people were just going after their transactional systems. And that was something that we had the luxury of being very public about now, and the financial services did a great job in responding to that. But that was an area where me as a practitioner that secured systems for 8 federal agencies is looking back going, holy crap, this is an active fight that is minute by minute with these guys. How are we helping everybody keep that, having the weakest link, take all of us down at this point? And so the good news was my antenna went up really high, really fast. And we had great people that were all over the place that were saying, we have a long strategic goal to improve these protections. All boats are going to rise together. We're going to elevate baselines across the board, but we're going to start with best practices to everybody, so we know that these are intelligence-driven best practices. And that really started to move the needle in a lot of areas without having to say why, which was very helpful.
I'm trying to think back to the last, 2016, that time frame. Cybersecurity attacks, especially on like critical infrastructure, have become something of a given for me. Mm-hmm. Right? That happens. I'm trying to think back to like 2016. I mean, this is the time of the Nigerian prince scam. Mm-hmm. Like that's the extent of things, as like spam emails, chains from your grandma, that kind of thing. Go back to like 2010 or so. It definitely seems like we've entered a new world, or at least we've all entered collectively as a society. Like we're now understanding there's something happening that, maybe in 2016 we didn't, and you got that initial like, oh, okay, this is really happening in a big way. Like there's a real adversary out there.
Yes, the OPM hack, it was the first transparent, like, oh crap, a lot of US citizen data was grabbed. And they attributed it and they said how it happened. But at the same time, they didn't say, oh, by the way, they're also trying this in 20 other places. It just seemed like a one-off. And so being in the public, not in a skiff at the time, it felt like a one-off, and it wasn't. And so that is part of the issue, is that we've gotten so much better at sharing that intelligence of the threat of that are the big 4 adversaries of the big 4, what their techniques are. In 2016, 2017, that was what can we say? And what can we not be too alarmist, but what can we put out that has this protective layer that goes from there? Now, I had the luxury of being in the room, not being the official that had to take this on operationally. I had the shadow of Chris Krebs, who was very great at this and did an amazing job leading that effort to make CISA, then NPPD, much more mature. And I had the luxury of Christian Nielsen, who was a cyber person as a background. So when I was at DHS, those 2 individuals, all the other storms that were brewing at DHS, were really helping lay a lot of these tracks and push forward to make sure that this was taken care of.
So let's take a step back. How exactly did you transition into this sort of environment? Like you mentioned, there's about a 15-year timeline in there. Mm-hmm. What happens in that time space? So
when you work for enough federal agencies, you end up getting some level of clearance. And so when the administration flipped at the end of 2016, my wife was working on the transition team and said, oh, I've got a great cyber person for you. And I think they actually wanted her to go in, and it was a bit of a bait and switch for them, but they accepted it. Her reputation carried the day, and it worked out. I get to joke that even though we're both from Alabama, you get more words per minute with me than you do with her. Her Alabamian is still much stronger. And so I can get more done in an hour in some of those cases. And you don't want her in your cyber
You really
team.
have learned to be inside the beltway here.
I have.
So you transition into DHS. You're there for how many years?
Tape to tape, January 20th to January 20th.
Okay.
Offered to stay, loved the mission. They told me it was somebody else's turn. And Avranga's doing a great job now in that seat.
Was it and you were a political appointee?
I was a political appointee, yes.
But far enough away from like I don't know, I guess I want to say the interjection of politics, but as a political appointee, your job wasn't to enforce political will?
No, it really wasn't. Not from my job. My job was to make sure that the authorities that we needed got the right attention and timely for things like asks. So if there was a need that CISA needed, for example, I had the luxury of there being the subpoena authority already being in place that is used today for the ransomware pilot program to work with ISPs when CISA sees something through its sensor network to reach out to that customer and say, hey, we think you have a problem. Somebody's trying to drop ransomware on you. That all goes back to that subpoena authority. So someone before me amplified that need, worked with Chris Krebs and the team to make sure that the NSC and the Hill and everybody else had the right understanding of what we were trying to do operationally and work from there. So I came in right at the time where a lot of good authorities had just been signed off on when CISA was created. So my job was really to keep DHS headquarters moving in a direction to work with the NSC as kind of a conduit on strategic policy, as opposed to trying to duplicate the efforts at CISA, because they had a runway they had to mature on, and so it's kind of maintaining that balance.
So you wrap up in January 21, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
What have you been doing since?
So I started with a company called Exeger. They're an amazing third-party service that does a lot of supply chain work. They use a lot of AI, a lot of fun tools. I got to work with them on getting everything FedRAMPed and IL certified, and that was a great experience builder as well. Seeing that from the outside as opposed to the inside was a different beast. They're doing great work. But GDIT came knocking and said, hey, we need you to help us with our strategy. So I've spent about a year and a couple months with Exeger and love that team, but moved over to the broader defense community because candidly, it was home similar to the way DHS was. So you're back in that providing that true national security broader mission set, not just the supply chain effort.
And so that's your role today?
My role today, I'm the Vice President of Cyber and Emerging Threats at GDIT. I'm within the Intel. It is. It's Intel.
No pressure.
No pressure at all.
It's within the GDIT, small organization.
Yes.
I've heard of them.
And so they're broken up into 3 divisions. I'm in the Intel and Homeland Security branch. And so there is a defense community, there is a Fed civilian community, and then there's Intel and Homeland. So I'm the Intel and Homeland side. I don't necessarily have an exact peer all the way across because they have different needs across the different divisions. But my job is to be strategic and work with our vendors to truly build strategies of where we need to have protection techniques and how we can build those into use cases to bring to folks so they have advanced, more mature, and really looking at transparent methods for them to improve their cybersecurity and leverage emerging tools like AI and keep an eye on things like quantum, which some feel is a boogeyman, some feel is like the next lightning to ride. At the same time, keeping up with all of that. Yeah,
well, in quantum, there's we're calling it the 4th industrial revolution or digital revolution. There's clearly something happening we're in the middle of. Mm-hmm. I'm sure it's always kind of hard to scope it while we're in the middle of it, but we are definitely going through something as a global society right now. Technologically, the hyperconnectivity, you have things like, what SpaceX has done to really improve connectivity in rural areas. You have the proliferation of mobile devices and phones to, people who would otherwise have spent life disconnected. So you have all these people coming online. We have all this new technology, whether it's AI or quantum computing as something that's emerging. You have change in how warfare is conducted. We have drones and all this. There's so much going on. As an outsider looking at the government and looking at things like our legislative capabilities and whatnot, it's pretty easy to criticize and levy some concern that we don't really feel like the institutions are prepared to take on the challenge of everything I just laid out. Mm-hmm. Do you agree, or do you think maybe we're a little too critical or not critical enough?
I'd say it depends on the day as to which way I'd answer that. I'd say we're pretty much in the middle right now. So you have a legislative body that I will be the first to say is not overly technical. There are not a lot of members of Congress that come from that background anymore. We have a handful that make up a cyber caucus. We have a handful that make up kind of that AI caucus. But even then, they're learning on the job. And that's fair, but they're not coming from a background in it. And so those conversations kind of start at a nuanced level of here's the problem, here's where we would like to see it go. And the good news is that they bring in very talented staff and they ask industry for advice. So there's stuff on the Hill that's moving, but it's maturing at a unique way. I'd say the federal government is looking to acquire technology and leverage technology, attempting to stay at pace, government speed, usually about 2 years behind, but still at pace with what they're seeing in industry is successful. So the conversation is good. The place where I feel the most sensitive is I don't know that if we had a critical infrastructure area that went out in, say, a rural environment that led to very bad situation, like potential casualty, healthcare related, something.
Sure. Which we already see to some level.
Well, I worry that we're not playbooking out what that authority need, or like going through that exercise with Congress would be very helpful. I think that they have not had that kind of scared mentality of this is a real reality, and they're kind of looking to say, okay, well, whose fault is it? And just like we talk about, it's very hard to blame the victim nowadays when it comes to ransomware in some of these very advanced cases.
Right.
So you have CISA and others working on secure by design to try and make us in a place where 10 years from now, we're not as at threat from the issues of the day. But how do we get from where we are today to there without more people getting hit by ransomware and services shutting down? That's a big issue. And I'm not certain without a bad guy to point to that the Hill's ready for it. We may have to leverage the current challenge we have with China and the issues where they are embedded in our critical infrastructure, as we've recently heard from the FBI director, as well as from the ODNI, that they're everywhere and that they have originally evolved from listening and intelligence to they're positioning for potential disruption and destruction. And that's something where you have a bad guy that hopefully all of Congress can get behind. But the traditional recent ransomware cases, when a critical infrastructure partner gets brought up to the Hill for a hearing, it's you should have done this better. Your protections weren't enough. And I don't think that's helpful for this body to mature, to be ready to handle that, so we don't get something just a mess of regulatory frameworks dropped on our head to make sure that incident doesn't happen a second time, as opposed to being more strategic in improving our ability that we work with cybersecurity from a congressional perspective, which is largely authorities and regulatory frameworks, but funding as well. And so that investment in the future is hard. When we talk to members on the Hill, the first thing they're going to say is you're going to be flat funded the next 24 months. So make use of that coin because it's all you're getting. And that's very hard in a world where costs aren't shrinking for protection techniques.
Yeah. And so as I think through it, there's so much in there that I want to talk about. That you bring up China, you bring up the threat against critical infrastructure. You bring up the fact they're everywhere. It's, they've proliferated. Cyber criminal gangs have proliferated. Like everything's in some state of compromise. So it's given way to, zero trust as a concept to defend against that and whatnot. But you get to the question of why are we not doing more? And when you really explore that, like whether it's the individual company level where it's like, they haven't been compromised, so they're kind of feeling like they don't need to invest in it. At like the national level, it hasn't been real enough. Mm-hmm. And I can't remember who the quote's from. I want to say it maybe the Secretary of the Navy said something along the lines of like in cybersecurity, it's like we're waiting for cyber Pearl Harbor to happen before anything meaningful is going to happen, which on the one hand, scary terminology, but certainly seems possible. That said, I don't know that that's going to happen, because if I'm China, which I'm not, that if I'm China, I'm not going to cross that. I'm not going to cross that line or cross the Rubicon there. I know once I do that, I'm finally going to get the attention of the United States to really have meaningful action on this. Why would I do that when I'm getting away with so much right now? And so when I think down that train, I'm wondering, why are they getting into our critical infrastructure if they're not going to actively use it as their nation state power to, turn off our water supply? Why are they getting access? What do they want out of this to, have the capability to do so? Is it in case things do break out into total war? Or do they have some other ulterior motive that's a little harder to track?
Well, what we know and this is the annual threat report covers a lot of this that we can just talk freely about, is that China has leveraged its ability to disrupt our critical infrastructure and our ability for DoD to do its thing as a tenet for its ability to engage in the Indo-Pacific. And so whether that's Taiwan or whatever their goals are, they are calculating that we are going to stumble at home due to chaos and lose public trust due to chaos to move forward. They don't have to turn off the lights in Washington, and they likely wouldn't. They would likely create an incident somewhere that doesn't impact the lives and the daily day of those decision makers. They would go for the edge somewhere that it's newsworthy, but doesn't impact the people in the District of Columbia. And that would cause enough resentment for our action to try and get public trust away, and also to sow chaos. Like with Colonial Pipeline, the greatest result that those adversaries got was the gas shortage and people running around with gas in bags. That wasn't necessary.
Oh my gosh, I forgot about that. The plastic.
That wasn't necessary, and it was flamed by everyone's, candidly, a look for a story around this. Like, oh no, gas is going to be gone. It technically was available. Had we just maintain calm, the Kevin Bacon role at the end of Animal House, we would have been a little better, but we sadly had the same effect as Kevin Bacon at the end of Animal House. Remain calm did not happen, and we had people running around buying all the gas they could find. That's the kind of end state that our adversaries see as valuable. They want to find something they can do that causes chaos, that changes the will of the United States people against whatever it is that we're engaging in, whether that be Ukraine, whether that be Taiwan, whether that be protecting generally Indo-Pacific, whether that be strengthening NATO, whether that be any of these efforts. They want to make sure that we know that they can poke at us and our culture enough to change sentiment to make a change in our direction. And that is the most damaging part of a lot of these cyber attacks.
Well, what concerns me there is, one, it seems like they're being successful.
Yes.
And the second piece of that, if the general consensus of people in our field seems to be that the decision makers, policymakers, legislators, whoever, are waiting for an overt big event, and we know our adversaries know they shouldn't do that because that will finally get the attention that they don't want. They can just keep doing what they're doing, and no one's really going to do a whole lot about it. What can change here? What can we do? Because we can't, like, if you and I are having this very, what seems an obvious conversation of like, of course, this is where this is going. What can we do about this?
So there's a few things that are good. The few things that are good are we're getting better at disruption at scale challenges. So if someone wanted to take down the power grid or wanted to disrupt the financial networks, those have been hardened. Those have been taken on as challenges nationally. And there's work being done. For example, the water treatment plants. We aren't going to be able to put federal resources into every water treatment plant, but the EPA can work with every water treatment plant that has availability to get cyber standards up. And so progressively make all the low-hanging fruit just a few feet higher. And so there's a goal there to at least impose cost at every turn. So if it's China, Russia, someone of the big bad four want to do something, it can't be as easy as it is today.
Right.
And so making it harder, i.e. more expensive, and working with our friends at Cyber Command to impose cost in the other direction to where they have challenges on their side is really that scale that's being deployed. So those are the good things. The bad news is that a lot of our discourse in working with the Hill is based on almost an extreme buy-in. So you have to get like the constituency to really sway towards your issue to get anything successfully through the Congress right now. So you're not getting common sense legislation. You're getting populist legislation that either one side or the other, or sometimes both, really mass behind. And that's why they say an event would make their life so much easier, because then you get the post 9/11 flag waving moment. I'm hopeful we don't get that.
No, we don't want that.
We don't want that. But to a legislator, they don't want that either. But they know if it does happen, there's opportunity to fix some wrongs and to really turn those knobs to raise the profile of our defensive techniques. And they're turning to people in government and saying, is there something right now you could do that would prevent this from happening? And that is where the challenge is. We don't have the ability to say, okay, we want every critical infrastructure partner to have federally paid for zero trust. The budget will never allow for that. We'll never have the ability to scale that. And there's candidly not enough us's around to go run out and do it right now. So we have a workforce challenge at the same time as a resource challenge. But working with everyone to know that that's the end goal is to have this better protections for networks, better protections for data. And at the same time, starting to get this concept of data as a national resource, because when we start looking at advanced technologies, let's say 5-10 years from now, I fully expect all of these AI, quantum, other things to be way more mature than they are today, but they're all still data dependent. What we've learned from AI manufacturers right now is that you can scrape the whole internet and still not get expertise. You can get facts, but not smarts. And so the curation of expertise that can be passed on through these systems is going to become very, very valuable. And so we need to get the security and detection aspect better for those so that we can maintain an edge moving forward where technology may solve some of these challenges as we move forward. Because it used to be you had a day or so to catch an adversary before they could make action on your network. Now it's minutes.
If that.
If that. And so you're not going to have the ability for human scale to do that. You have to have automated tools, but those automated tools are still only authorized to do so much. And so as we get more mature where we can actually get expertise into these platforms as opposed to just facts and patterns, that's where we're going to get a lot of change. And I want to see us to start moving chips on the table in that direction, because I don't think we're going to be able to cast a net or build a giant firewall that's going to be any more effective.
No, I don't know that we want that either.
No. Government-sponsored firewalls is probably a very bad idea. There's also a challenge where we see it failing for the populace in other countries that are using it for different reasons. So it's just really that, how does the government improve the protection of a nation and its value of your own data? Like we had this conversation with the public around TikTok, like people would actively say, I don't care if China gets my data. And you look at them and you say, but you should, because your cumulative actions on your device, your lifestyle, your patterns are educating them on expertise to exploit us, as opposed to developing expertise that you may be able to market in the future as your own data. So think of it as a piggy bank. You need to save your data for later.
You're giving it away for free.
And you're just giving it all away.
It's like they say, if it's free, you're the product.
Absolutely. And so getting people in that direction, public safety announcements and such, working with the federal government and industry to sit at the table and say, where can we make big moves to get expertise-based tools to start doing mass level identification, disruption of bad guy efforts? Like that's going to be the strongest position we can take, and working with critical infrastructure to try and know what's the most at risk and working from there, using a risk-based model to protect it till we get a better system in place that we haven't figured out yet today.
Well, one of the big tools that I get exposed to in my world, so I work with a lot of defense contractors, and we're getting all this regulatory requirements around cybersecurity compliance. And so the current tool the government seems to use is something of a stick, which is like, here's the list of things that we've described as minimally viable, which, by the way, private industry typically reads as like, oh, that's all we ever have to do, right? It's like minimum standard. But anyway, the government issues that and holds the stick, says, we'll stop giving you money if you don't follow this. On the one hand, I see the need for it because a lot of companies won't do anything unless they're told to with the stick. On the other hand, I find compliance, as I'm a security practitioner through and through, it feels ham-fisted to me. It feels imprecise, but seems like a valuable instrument and a big tool in the government's toolbox. My question to you is that a valuable tool? Is that the primary tool? Is it being used appropriately?
It's the lever they know. And so when we look at things like CMMC, zero trust maturity scales, potential incident reporting frameworks, they know regulatory, tell me what happened, and they know, show me the preparation that documents what we perceive as intent that we can hold you accountable for. And so there's not really a good way for the government to jump in and say, let's talk strictly only outcomes, because the body of work can't support determining if those outcomes are being met or not through their own individual evaluations. So hopefully we will get to that point where it's strictly outcome driven, and we can give, like, these are the 30 outcomes you have to maintain from a security perspective.
I would love that.
And that would be the
Seems
new world.
idealistic.
It is, because the government doesn't have the professionalism on the other side, because they don't have enough of us on the inside to be able to work those reverse engineer wise as those outcomes are being met. And so the documentation side is where the compliance angle comes in. And so I don't think we're going to be done with FedRAMP, FISMA, or CMMC, or any of the zero trust mandates anytime soon. But I think they're at least getting to a point where they're evolvable. Like when we work with NIST, it used to be very discrete. Now they're talking about control families, and they're talking about control families that have broad scope, and talk to us about how you're meeting that control family. And it's a better conversation, but it's still isolated to control families. And so there's work to be done there to make that kind of more bolstered for flexibility for meeting outcomes in a unique way. And especially if there is this expertise-based technology that swoops in and starts to save the day in the future, how does that fit in that regime if it doesn't have, 90 days backwards of a specific log, things like that. I think that there's hope because they all know they can't keep up with it. I think they know, the regulatory frameworks know, the managers know, the industry knows, this is a point in time. It's not an evolvable product. We're either going to have to do this constantly or open that aperture to be more flexible.
You hit on a very important point, which I think addresses a common criticism around compliance, and it's one that I've levied, right? But I'm a security professional. I don't need to be told how to specifically do something necessarily. So I get very frustrated with like CMMC and NIST 171 because often I'm like, you're holding me back. Mm-hmm. Let me do this a different way. You're very specific. Give me some broad outcomes you want. Let me demonstrate to you how that's met. But to your point, well, the government doesn't always have someone who's going to understand how you got to the outcome or that outcome is actually met. And then there are not a lot of views, us, to engage in private industry and the hundreds of thousands of organizations that are in just like the defense supply chain to competently achieve outcomes. So there's a place for minimum configuration type work to exist. That I think when you're in the thick of it and you're a security practitioner and you look at things like CMMC, all you see is the imprecise, ham-fisted, common thing, the lever the government always pulls. And you can be very cynical and be like, they know nothing. They're just pulling their lever. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It's just what they know how to do. No, I think there's a lot more reason behind it than we give credit to.
Yeah, and the recent CMMC stuff is tied directly to NIST as opposed to select DoD controls that are DoD only. So give them credit for unifying at least the message. Like, hey, you have to deal with NIST. Now you deal with NIST to achieve this certification. So it's at least tied to a different type of work. I also will do a quick plug. My current employer is very good at this. And so I have the enjoying factor of GDIT and 8,000 other cyber people working in the building. That gives you a little bit of confidence that the government at least has resources to deploy across the board. So when we start working for Uncle Sam in those mission areas, we're making sure that those outcomes are being understood and things like that. I get a little bit of confidence in seeing my company, and we work with a lot of great other companies. We refer to each other as competimites that across frenemies, yes, that all have similar workforces, that have similar things that they're making different investments in and strengthening their workforce around. But it's giving the government tools to work with that aren't just inside their building. And so it's allowing them to cheat the evolution scale by bringing in smart companies to work with them around the board. So that's the one plug I'll make, is that there is...
It's not the only one you can make. You can make as many as you want.
That's the one that I really like, is that our workforce is great and that we have a lot of talented professionals and the government knows it and they use it. And that's really where I'm happy to see them reaching out on things like AI and how do you make your systems more secure and more resilient when you're using AI in these tool sets. And that's what you want. You want the government to reach out and say, there's potentially a contract down the road, but just talk to us about what you're doing right now, because we see you as someone who's made investments in that area. And whether it's digital engineering, whether it's zero trust, they want to sit down and say, how are you doing that? And then that shapes future opportunity down the road just because they are better informed. And so that's a good shining object that we're seeing out there right now.
And so from what you're seeing, the government is asking private industry, lead us.
Yes.
You guys are the innovators. You kind of know what's going on. Lead us, as opposed to coming to you with here's the solution we want, please build.
Correct. And it's a challenge for a lot of us in the defense contractor space, because that's what you're used to. Right. You're used to, bring me a rock. This rock has to weigh this much. It needs to look this big. Go find it. It's your job to produce it at this price. And this is more, I want to know how you're doing this and bring me solutions that meet the needs of the problem I have. So it's more of an intimate relationship about use cases than it ever has been.
Well, honestly, that's good to hear.
It is.
Because that's, I think, the wisest approach when you're in their position, in the government's position. You're not expert at this stuff. You can't be by nature of what you do. You move too slow. You're an aircraft carrier. You can't turn, right? You can turn very slowly. Mm-hmm. Look to industry who's, sometimes driving little boats that can make quick turns and whatnot, and try something. That didn't work. We'll come back, come back and figure something out.
Learn from our investments as opposed to challenging their own.
Right. And fund incentivize us to be that way. That's the instrument we should be. And there's a microcosm of this in the compliance world. So I live in the CMMC world. This is what I do day in, day out. Help primarily small, medium-sized defense contractors who are often going through digital transformation while also having to deal with cybersecurity and compliance for the first time. And I've thankfully been party to a lot of conversations with the government and DoD about the development of that program and the adoption of the new requirements in Revision 3 and whatnot. And I get very frustrated because I often find the government's default position on how industry should do things is the government way. Mm-hmm. Like, in absence of other information, well, industry should just do what the federal government does. And I try to remind them, well, there's a reason why you have us. There's a reason why we're industry and your government. Yes, we're both handling similar data sets at some level, but you shouldn't apply your standard to us. You're the biggest monolith of monoliths that exists. We're sometimes a 50-person shop that can try stuff out and tell you how it worked as we tried it out. Don't take that away. Yeah. You need that and you want that, and that's how we're going to make progress. But, sometimes that falls on deaf ears.
They're doing some pilot work in a lot of different areas, which is fun. But for CMMC, they're sticking to their guns on, we know a compliance regime when we see it. We see a NIST standard when we see it, and go.
Yeah, no, they've been pretty uniform in their pushing of that. And I know there's, there's some rumoring around how quickly they want to get it through and that a potential administration change could eliminate that. I don't buy that. I find that I feel like that train's left the station. They've been on message for how many years straight now? 4 or 5 years straight. Mm-hmm. This is coming. It's happening this way. Get with the program. Make progress. What I will find interesting, and maybe you can weigh in on this, I always use the example, who has actual influence at the Pentagon? Right now, CMMC is being run largely by acquisition sustainment. I know it's the DoD CIO now, but at some point, some general who has a theater under their command wants some material, some equipment, some part, and they're not going to get it. And someone's going to say, yeah, somewhere down the line, a machine shop didn't have their certification, so we couldn't source it in time, so you can't have your toy. Something tells me the stink is going to be big enough at the Pentagon where they might have to back off a little bit on something like CMMC and say, okay, maybe not as binary as it's originally been designed, because the people with real influence at the Pentagon, I don't know this for a fact. I imagine it's the field commanders and the people who want the things in theater. I could be totally wrong, but that's my assumption.
Well, the good news is that for in theater, again, I'm on the IHS side, not so much the defense side of the world of GDIT. So I'll speak out of school just a little from my experience when I was in government. And so Defense Department, when they looked at this originally, they were coming from a threat-based challenge. They saw the defense industrial base as an adversarial target, and they saw that the bigs were hardening well, and their suppliers were becoming targets down the line. And through the way that our contracts are, you can identify who's subcontracting to whom and where you're getting your parts from, and it can be seen from outside eyes. And so that started a chain reaction where they're like, well, we have to pardon and protect all the way down to the spring. It can't be because the amount of information to design that spring is what we know that the collective, if they went for every part across every distributed supply chain for all our defense contractors, they can get a holistic view of what we're trying to do that we don't want our adversaries to have. And so to your point about it shifting winds I agree with you. I think whether that changes names to be MCCM or CMMC, it's going to exist into whatever the next administration is, because that conversation in the skiff is never good, and it's not going to get better until there is at least a floor that they can apply and get some confidence that people at least have stated on paper, at least at CMMC level 1, I am doing this, and this is my contact to prove that I'm doing this. And that's the floor that they're trying to execute down those supply chains. When you get more advanced, you get more advanced. And when you get more sensitive, you get more sensitive. But that's where they're building confidence to stop having that emotion every time you leave that vault of, oh crap, this is just going to happen. And so they've got to get something in place.
Now, in your role and your background, wide purview, it sounds like there's all kinds of angles. And there's, of course, as I talked about, we're in this digital revolution. There's so many things going on. Are there any in particular that like you're keyed in at, or that keep you up or concern you greatly, where you're like, not enough being talked about here?
So I'm still very much a person that appreciates good science fiction and good nerdery. And so I have this challenge. I have a sibling that works in genetics, and she's doing amazing work. But when I take the work that she's doing in my head and start thinking, okay, when that gets cheaper, and we start getting our genetic material in the form of a fingerprint digitally, where does that going to live? Right. You know, like I start thinking of the way the government's going to start to interpret it. Who should store it? Is it a personal storage? Is it and it compounds greatly. And I'm thinking that's probably 4 years out. And so I look at the efforts that DoD is doing. I look at the efforts DHS is doing, and even Commerce with their trade policy stuff, trying to make sure like the Kasperskys of the world aren't on everyone's network. I then turn and say, is even HHS ready for the nuanced data that's going to need to be protected? Just like that expertise training data that we talked about earlier for AI, you're going to have very sensitive data that no human is going to want shared with anybody unless they dedicated it especially for that reason. And who holds that? And who protects that? And where does that role come in? And that's one where I'm not sure we're ready for it yet. And I'm hoping that they start to build up some muscle memory now for traditional health record management, which they are working on, and health clouds and things like that. But there's going to be a new realm of sensitive records that once they're leaked, there's no credit monitoring that solves it. You know, there's no backfill, there's no subscription to solve this problem once your DNA map is out there. You know, it's that kind of thing that I'm nervous as we get more technologically savvy and we get more advanced with digital tools. How do all of those work together for both personal as well as macro security for the things we try to put out there? Because bio is something that has the government's attention as well. Bioengineering is a big thing that's going to work. And they're going to need a lot of background data to do it. And we don't want our adversaries cheating the system by stealing all of ours.
That and bio and genetics, that's a whole other emerging technology that we could get into like a philosophical discussion about, because not just are we going to be able to capture that data and store it somewhere, we're going to be able to manipulate that data. I think that's a lot of the real work we see in genetics with things like CRISPR. Like we're getting to the point, it's not far-fetched. It's not a dystopian sci-fi future where people can do gene editing for developing embryos and do stuff like decide what color hair their baby's going to have or how tall their baby's going to be and things like this. It's going to get very weird. And I don't know that we're morally ready for that. I don't think we're. Yeah.
But it's still an IT problem. So it's something we look out for. You know, it's like all this, there's a big shoulder to carry all of this, you know, but at the same time, the IT aspect of just moving this around, you know, the challenge we had just getting people off thumb drives. We start thinking about that. It's just.
Look, man, I still occasionally have to argue with someone to turn on multi-factor authentication. Right. And you get pushback where they're like, what does, China care about me for? I'm like, because you work for Lockheed.
Yeah.
Like you guys provide supplies to Raytheon or whoever. Like that's why they would be interested in you. And some people, another regular refrain I hear is like, listen, we've been doing this for 30 years, kid. Like, we haven't had to do this before. Why are you coming to us to tell us we need to suddenly spend all this money? Like, well, because you haven't been doing this for 30 years. Somewhere in the past 10 years, you moved all your infrastructure to the cloud, or you turned your paper processes into digital. You're not doing things exactly as you always have done. And when you made those investments to keep pace with the world, you created a burden for yourself down the line. I'm sorry to be the messenger of that burden,
right?
But you want to continue to operate on the connected internet and have all this phenomenal capability in the digital space. It's time to, pay the price in a way, and you have to secure it because it is of interest to our adversaries. We know that clearly now, and it's not just GDIT they're after. They know that GDIT employs, I think you said something like 8,000 cyber professionals.
Yeah.
They know they're big, juicy targets, invest a lot of money. They know you don't, right? And they're coming for you now because that's, as you mentioned, their lowest cost entry to their objective is increasingly you, small business, in whatever supply chain they're interested in.
Yeah, and what we're really seeing is they're going on edge devices, no matter what network you're on, and they're looking for credentials, and they're looking to see who has good credentials and who has better credentials, and just working their way up the stack and just sitting on those networks. And if you don't have MFA, then your credentials have been harvested and can be used to bounce all over that network. And so that's why it's the first words out of Jen Easterly's mouth is MFA first, MFA second, MFA third, and then let's talk about secure by design. That's because it's that freedom of movement by just having those credentials be a token as opposed to an authenticated token. And so it's a challenge.
It's also wise that we've moved the conversation to identities. We always talk about, the new perimeter used to be your corporate network, and you could think of it like a castle and a moat, and your firewall being the drawbridge or whatever. Like that's gone. Goodbye. Now it's identities because everything accessible everywhere, all the time, 24/7, 365, amongst a mass of tools and applications and areas to put data, all comes down to your identity protection. And just having a username and password floating around out there,
and the good news is with all of those analogies, crown jewels has stayed the same. So you still can't lose your crown jewels no matter what the challenge.
Right. Now you just have them sitting out in the town square.
Right.
It's a lot. It seems a little scarier now.
Yes.
The attack surface is a bit more robust. But I want to get your take on AI.
Okay.
I talk about this a lot. I feel like cybersecurity as an industry can be fairly alarmist. And then you have we've all seen going back to 2001, A Space Odyssey, and every sci-fi film since when AI gets brought in, like AI is always going to destroy humanity. For the first time, people are working with things like ChatGPT, and it's really eye-opening what it can do, as limited as it is. And I think it's tremendously limited. You can find very quickly the limits of something like ChatGPT. Still manages to surprise me sometimes. Are we being alarmist to start this take around like, this thing's getting a little too powerful. We better slow down and put the controls in place before we get Skynet? Well,
right now we're in a world where we're just doing advanced automation. And I would love to say that automation at speed, there's like OpenAI is doing some very impressive things with ChatGPT, and Microsoft is working to integrate that. And we're seeing it a lot in the coding, but that's still very mechanical. When we start talking about AI in the Terminator sense, a lot of that comes from decision making and the ability to bypass controls to solve a problem because the AI can make up its own rules as it goes. And that's where the concern really is how do you put boundaries on something that currently you're entrusting to maintain boundaries? And so we're not seeing that now. Right now, adversarial AI is to break the logic of an executed, like for example, the very annoying people who put the little reflective squares on speed limit signs that make cars auto drive systems screw up.
I haven't heard of that. That's
okay. So for example, say you have a 70 mile per hour sign, they can put a little reflective square in just the right place. There was I forget if it was Berkeley or somewhere else. They wrote a paper on it. And so now we've got these computer scientists and the like out there seeing if it works, putting that sticker on, and then your car that has the advanced cruise control sees the sign and kicks you down to 35 miles an hour while you're driving down the road. And so it's not that the sign is saying 35, it's just tweaked in a way that the algorithm responds differently. And that's the kind of thing we're trying to watch out for, because that's very hard to catch, especially when it's vision-based, text-based. If you include a string of characters, does it break the divide by zero kind of thing. There's ways to gum up the works with a lot of our AI products right now that we're trying to make sure we're defending against. The same way you would have people trying to execute JavaScripts and login credentials, that kind of thing. So we're trying to make sure we're good at that before we get any more advanced. And then the learning aspect and the crawling aspect. They want to make sure that as we train data, we're not going to leak PII or sensitive materials in the results that just shouldn't be there. And so making sure that as we introduce more and more data into these models, especially the LLMs, that they don't have the ability to export the controls and bypass those controls to share information they shouldn't. And that's where we're seeing a lot of the focus right now from a security perspective. On the offensive side, it's a great tool. I mean, you're getting efficiency at scale. Even if it's not great, you could have an Intel analyst come up with their own approach to a particular threat scenario, and they can use AI to kind of counterbalance. Say, okay, why am I wrong? And have it debate.
Right.
And that's teaching both
iterate.
sides and iterate and come out at the end with a better product. And so you're seeing those types of AI use cases that's making country more safe. It's educating those that are in the professional space with more tools, but it's not replacing anyone. It's just a tool that's very helpful and makes things more efficient. We are going to have to figure out as we advance what is going to be the watcher of the watchers, because as we have digital systems that have kind of hard-coded boundaries, how are those not going to be tweaked or adjusted as we move forward?
Well, and you talk about hard-coded boundaries. I think of, there's a sci-fi concept. I've seen it in many movies where there's like universal rules you can program into AI, like you don't hurt people and whatnot. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of assuming that that's not going to just be removed by some bad actor.
Right.
And I see, with things like drones and AI, it's starting to become a real, you're creating a lower barrier to entry to cause a lot of havoc for a bad actor as that stuff progresses. Then consider the compounding nature that AI should empower, where you could potentially work with an AI platform to say, here's my target, here's my outcome. I want you to bring down this infrastructure. Here's your command, go iterate. And the AI can try millions of times until it gets it right. Where you, as say you're a red teamer, you move at the pace of a keyboard.
Right.
That's going to empower bad actors so strongly. Combine it again with something like drones and what we're seeing in current conflict, where they're able to deliver kinetic payloads that are very hard to disrupt. It just seems like there's some danger being created. And again, I try not to get pessimistic about it because I really am an optimist at heart.
I think what you're going to see is back to your original, the way the body operates. You're not going to have an AI that does everything. You're going to have the five senses. You're going to have, an AI program that does this part, an AI that does that part, and then you have them working together in almost that neural net of combining different systems with resiliency built in, so that it knows if something's weird. Like if you have one hand and one saying boiling and one saying freezing, you got to figure out what's going on, because that's not right. And so you get that kind of challenge that we see across the board in major industrial systems. They don't rely on one sensor, they rely on a network of sensors. And so we're going to have to do AI in a similar platform where we have dedicated tools that are very good at what they do, get that error rate down, and go from there.
How about quantum computing? Is that all hype, or are we starting to see anything real there?
Well, the funny part is the movies aren't that wrong with time travel. It's just their concept of time travel is wrong. We're going to get answers faster than we should. And so when things should have taken 3 years of calculation and it gets done in 15 minutes, that's time travel. And that is what we're going to start to see with quantum computing, is that it's going to be able to take very large data problems, and it's going to be able to negate them down to very short turns on processing. From a high performance computing aspect, it's going to be revolutionary. From a sensing aspect, it's going to be revolutionary. I don't know about everything else. Like communications is a great sector to see it, to get it deployed and practice from there. Quantum computing itself is getting faster, getting better. We still have a lot of challenges as to which direction it's going to go. Is photonics going to win versus other types? The cost is so much greater for everything else that has less noise. But at the end of the day, you're going to see a hardened encryption as a result of the concept.
It's going to have to be.
And we can't have bad encryption out there now, because if this system starts to take on encryption challenges, which it hasn't yet, but once we have that post-quantum moment, everything that was encrypted that's been stolen over the last few years now is fair game. And so that's what we're trying to dodge right now, is enriching the community with better encryption options, better signatures, better technologies that, for all we know today, are better for quantum computers not to break in a timely manner. And what are those use cases where it's going to make life better and gain that time travel advantage of, instead of taking 3 years, it takes 15 minutes?
Do you know, is there an expectation, whether inside the government or the Hill or wherever, of timeline here?
Well, the good news is on encryption, they've done a lot of work. And so there's a lot of protection techniques. Like I would say for those national security systems, I'm not worried about them. They have already moved ahead with all the things they need to do.
Did you know, is there an expectation of timeline for that post-quantum moment?
Oh, we always get told 10 years.
You're getting told 10 years for the last 10 years.
Yes, exactly. I would say we're probably in that 6 to 8 range when we talk to the smartest boys and girls we can find. But they're still not confident enough to say 5. So that's when they start saying 5, that's when I get more nervous.
Okay, all right. So it really is coming at that moment.
Yes.
6 to 8, you can kind of continue.
Yeah, like they're like, we're closer than we were when we said 10. We're not at 5 yet. And so that's, I think, the smartest PhDs out there that are working this are saying, we're looking at, maybe the 6 to 8 year window for that decryption challenge.
I always find it interesting. It's total non sequitur, but sort of on that line. Like, I always find it interesting when we ask people to give us a timeline when you're going to have innovated this thing that you haven't innovated. So how could you possibly really know how long it's going to take you?
Right.
We always have that, and that's why it's like, well, it's 10 years ago. Yeah. Right. Because it's all guesswork.
Yes.
So there is I've seen some pushback around quantum where some people are saying, like, hey, we're 50 years away. Like, we're vastly overestimating our ability to do it. Then you have other people like, no, man, we're almost there.
Well, and the language effort for coding this is leveraging AI now. And so you're getting efficiency of scale and expediting that process through leveraging training of quantum languages on AI.
Right. So not just the calculations that you're talking about, like the progression of technology, we should even see that timeline compress.
Yes.
It's going to be a very interesting world that we're getting into. I think the rest of our lives is certainly going to be fascinating from a technical standpoint to see what happens with all this technology, and then how we manage to control it and keep it from its, the threats that we're talking about. Hopefully we're up to the task. I get a lot of optimism when I talk to people like you, who have, both been in private industry, advising government, been inside government. I do think this stuff requires government focus at the highest level, right? And it's good to see things like, from the executive department, from the White House, a national cyber agenda and a cyber strategy, and see that filter down. Creation of CISA as an institution. That gives me reason to hope. But it's clear we have a lot of work ahead of us. The last technical topic I want to get into with you is around critical infrastructure, and what we're doing to protect our critical infrastructure, what the threats are. I wonder if you want to talk at all about like election security and where that's gone, and what CISA has done to secure our elections. It's approaching. We're having a big election here in this year, right? And
we're months away.
We're months away, and to put it simply, there is some questions around the security there. What can you speak to there?
So the good news is that as a community, there was a time, 2016, where not every election official saw the federal government's role in this area. We have a unified set of state and local electors that work with CISA as a best practices kind of governance body to really make sure they have every tool they need, and to help them with making sure that their systems are hardened properly, and to work with them as they have their own ISAC now, they have their own networking community, they communicate with each other very openly on best practices, don't connect that voting machine to the internet kind of thing. So I share the same confidence that the agency does, that we have a system in place that allows for an individual to cast their ballot, that ballot to be counted, and that count to be something they can audit, and that there's not a cyber means to disrupt that process. Now, where we get into challenges is the Secretary of State's website. If they're putting some set of numbers as they go up and that website gets DDoSed and just put down, what's that going to do to the confidence of people about elections? The integrity of the numbers was never changed. The website was technically secure and sound the whole time, but somebody just disrupted its access for an hour. What is the public going to think about that? And so that's where we get into this challenge of the chaos theory. And the work has been done to secure all those platforms from point A to point B. But can the public handle if, there's somebody steps on a rake DDoS-wise and disrupts the system and delays something or just allows for an adversary to create confusion and to pretend that they hack something? Like when we see someone say, go out and buy voter rolls, put it on the dark web and say, look, I stole all these voter rolls, and you're like, okay, that's not what happened. But at the same time, the narrative is out there like, right. Oh, all these voting machines had to have been hacked because how would they get this voter information? And you're like, well, they probably bought it and disrupted us just on purpose just to make this a little more chaotic. I think that the work CISA has done from an election perspective is very strong. But again, it's not the work CISA is doing. It's that partnership across the entire country of all these local and state folks doing their thing. Critical infrastructure writ large, they're under attack every hour, every day by Chinese adversaries, Russian adversaries, Iranians, North Koreans. They all want a different thing. Some of it's just to put, cryptocurrency miners on their system. You run up their cloud bill, make some money back home. I mean, it's all kinds of different things that they have to focus on. And they're having to defend themselves as if they were the Pentagon at every moment, which is hard.
Are we doing enough to support critical infrastructure, or are we starting to at least see some of that shift?
There's a definition that came out in the last set of the congressional NDAA type stuff where we have now a plan to implement systemically important. And so we're going to see what that is. That's the evolution for critical infrastructure, where there's like, look, there's critical infrastructure and there's critical infrastructure. Are they going to go for the have-nots as the critical SIE, I believe, systemically important entities list first? Or are they going to start with the bigs? Like, okay, we know we can't lose power. We know we can't lose money. We can't, the core critical functions. So it's going to be interesting to see that policy ladder develop. But there's going to be an extra layer of systemically importance coming out that they're going to try and address extra services, extra protection options, shared services, whatever, to try and make sure that those particular elements don't go down without a fight. Because again, there's no assumption that they're ever going to not be attacked. It's just how defensible they can be.
Right. It's always all going to be under attack. Ceaseless, right? And it's only going to get worse. And the fire with which they can attack us is going to continue to get better. It's like the fire that we use to fight back and to defend ourselves with needs to outpace them. We've had a number of discussions on the podcast where it can paint the picture of like, hey, we kind of fell behind here off the jump with some of this more recent technical development. We're starting to see we're gaining and we'll likely pass everyone now that we're starting to see some unified approach, but we're certainly kind of falling behind the eight ball a little bit in some of these things. But I think, in talking to you and hearing your experience, again, both public sector and where you're at in the private sector now, knowing there's people who are having these conversations, knowing there's people trying to educate legislators and regulators and expand the reach of cybersecurity as a concept and increase the visibility of its importance, gives me some hope. There's plenty that I always talk about when we get into these cybersecurity and national security conversations. We're, of course, talking about the issues, which can paint a picture that can feel kind of pessimistic, right? We talk about all these new emerging technologies and the impact they could have, the danger they can pose. It can certainly paint a picture of like, wow, it's a dangerous world. And it's only going to get more dangerous. It can lead you to some pessimism. Like I said, I'm an optimist at heart. So the tradition here on the Watchers is as the final sort of question against that backdrop of pessimism, what keeps you optimistic?
So good people are doing good things. When I go in, there's not a room that I've been in across government or industry where they're accepting that we're going to lose this fight. Like there's not we're going to go through this and I hope it works kind of mentality. It's we're not going to lose. And so that makes me feel confident, no matter if in government or out of government, that they have good people driving this. Now, there's also institutional knowledge that's being gained with every step we take, and we're building from that as opposed to starting from ground zero every time. So every time there's an incident, we used to have an Iranian threats bulletin from CISA when there was an Iranian-based attack. Now they're using this control family. This might be Iranian. We'll do attribution later, but this is what you need to pay attention to if you have this type of software running in this type of environment. And know your environment and fix it. It's that kind of evolution that really is showing strength and showing that we're giving active threat intel to people who normally would have no idea what to do with it, with actual operational insights to fix and protect.
So we're seeing progress.
Absolutely.
In a meaningful way. Well, that's good. And that gives me something more to be optimistic about, which there's plenty to be optimistic about. So Matt, pleasure. Thank you for coming on the show. Is there anything you want to plug? Any social media?
I would just say that GDIT is making a lot of investments in things like quantum and things like AI. We have a whole set of digital accelerators that we're working on right now, and that's where I get to have the most fun, is going to engage with those groups to see what they're finding and seeing where they can take government next. And so I would say that's where I'm having my most fun right now, is taking that information to our customers and saying, you got to have this sit down. This meeting is great, and they get to see my smile come in, like, oh, I found something good, and so that's
bring that excitement.
Yeah. So that's the fun of the moment. That's what I would plug, is that coming to a theater near you, we've got some fun stuff that we get to show.
And you personally, can people find you on LinkedIn?
Absolutely.
Everywhere else?
I don't hide well.
Okay,
there's not many of us that have an Alabama accent and run around DC that claim to be in the cyber community. Most of us, if they're from Alabama, they either in the national defense sector down in Huntsville, where I came from, and they like it there better. They're like, why would you be in this swamp? And so I'm available.
I know the perfect way to end this then. We'll just end it on a nice Roll Tide.
Absolutely. Looking forward to the new coach, seeing what he can pull off.
Matt, it was a pleasure. Thanks, man.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Watchers. For more great content, be sure to like, subscribe, and check out our channel. We'll see you on the next one.